Chapter 8: Palestinian Statehood in the 18th Century, Early Modernities and Practical Sovereignty. In Palestine, the Eurocentric analysis of the Arab states has failed to recognize that most of the Arab countries and their borders are closely based on long, pre-colonial, historical precedents, including the naming of states. In the case of Palestine, as in the case of most other Arab political entities, traditionally and throughout the Middle Ages the name Palestine had indicated both an exact geographic location and the identity of their, predominantly, but not exclusively, Arab Muslim population. Moreover, the history of modern Palestine is often studied from and with European, Ottoman and Zionist settler perspectives. The autonomous agency and voice of Palestine and the Palestinians themselves are seldom recognized. With this imperial and colonial mindset, historians of the modern Middle East also tend to focus on the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman reforms, which is also part of a long Western tradition of preoccupation with imperial chronologies of the Near East, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, Ottoman, British, etc. Yet their Dawla al-Qatriyar, or the country, state, the Arabic term Qtr being a country, as a parachronism, and whether traditionally in the form of sultanate, emirate, kingdom, khanate, sheikhdom, wilayat, caliphate or any other name, was one of the most common forms of statehood throughout Muslim history and in Muslim-majority countries, a statehood which often enjoyed practical sovereignty. The Caliphate of Cordoba, 929 to 1031 AD, the Emirate of Granada, 1230–1492, the Khanates of Central Asia, the Sultanate of Oman, 1741 to the present, the Beys of Tunis, 1705–1957, the Emirate of Mount Lebanon, 1516–1841, the First Saudi State, the Emirate of Dir, 1744–1818, and the Wilayat of Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt, 1805–1948, are only a few examples of how incredibly widespread this form of statehood was throughout Muslim history. Some dual Qatriyar, such as the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, 1250–1517, were far more powerful than the Muslim Caliphate of Baghdad during the 11th–13th centuries. Far from being an aberration, the Dawla Qatriyar became common throughout the Arab and Islamic worlds, especially after the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate in the second half of the 9th century AD, and many of these independent states enjoyed a great deal of prosperity and spectacular cultural developments. For instance, the independent Emirate of Aleppo, which encompassed most of northern Syria and parts of western Al-Jazeera, was founded in 944 by the Hamdanid princes and became the seat of an independent emirate under Saif al-Dawla. It enjoyed a period of great prosperity and became home to the greatest Arab poet, al-Mutanabbi, and one of the greatest philosophers of Islam, the polymath al-Farabi, the author of the Opinions of the People of the Virtuous City, also known as the Perfect State, al-Farabi 1985. This rich historical legacy of the Dawla Qatriyar, whose modern equivalent is the Dawla Wataniya or national state, was a factor in the emergence and construction of a two-tier Watani Qawmi nationalism in the Arab world and in Muslim-majority Palestine in the early 20th century. Today the Arab world consists of 21 states, or dual Qatriyar, excluding Palestine. Pan-Arab nationalist ideologues often argue that the failure of Arab unity schemes and the predominance and durability of Old Dawla al-Qatriyar in the Arab world are primarily the product of the colonial legacy. But this argument is made in disregard of their historical legacy of statehood under Islam, Arab indigenous agency, the distinct local and regional traditions and the ancient local roots and historical autonomy of many Arab societies. In fact, as we shall see below, European colonialism prevented the creation of a Dawla Qatriyar in Palestine. Moreover, Arabic toponyms such as Palestine, Palestine, Egypt, Syria, Libya, Iraq or the Yemen all have deep and ancient historical roots and indigenous legitimacy of self-definition. Furthermore, the indigenous agency behind the creation of Palestinian statehood, the Emirate of Dar al-Ummah, in 18th century Palestine, which was a form of Dawla Qatriyar, is a case in point. The revival and spread of ancient toponyms such as Palestine, Palestine in the modern era was derived from the common use of the name in ancient history, from the late Bronze Age onwards, and throughout classical antiquity, Byzantine Christianity and medieval Islam. Although the colonial legacy and influence of European ideas about their nation-state contributed to the rise of a two-tier, Watani-Kormi, form of nationalism in the Arab world, local roots and regional historical legacies must be part of the mix of factors for the emergence and domination of the Dawla Qatriyya throughout the Arab world. Revivalism and rediscovery under Ottoman rule, the Arab-Islamic jurisprudence of Palestine and indigenous memories of Palestine under the Ottomans, 1517–1860s. Under the Ottoman Empire, 1517–1917, Palestine was used both as a general term to describe the predominantly Arab Muslim country in the southern Sham region, and as a social and cultural term among the indigenous people of Palestine. By this stage, Muslim-majority Palestine had developed a strong tradition of Arab-Islamic jurisprudence, one of the most crucial requirements of any sense of autonomous polity. The long Ottoman period reinforced the already close historic links between Palestine and the Ul-Sham region, an Arab-Islamic geographic term which had been coined during the early Islamic period and referred to the territories of present-day Syria, Palestine, Jordan and southern Turkey, while Ul-Sham often referred to the specific capital city of Damascus, Ul-Sham. Palestine was not an official designation under the Ottomans, and some Arabs during this period referred to the area as Ul-Sham, a term which should not be conflated automatically or exclusively with present-day Syria and their modern myth of Surya ul-Janubiyya, or, as some Arab intellectuals continue to assert, one southern Syria. The term southern Syria was invented and popularized in 1919–1920 and was derived from two modern currents, a late 19th century Syrian Kormi nationalist ideology, and b. the circumstances surrounding the formation of the pan-Arab nationalist regime in Damascus headed by Emir Faisal in 1919–1920. See below. Whether or not southern Syria was also related to the ancient Roman designation Syria-Palestina is not clear, yet the indigenous, shared memories of medieval Arab-Islamic Palestine and Byzantine Palestina were kept alive throughout the Ottoman period both in Palestine and in Europe. Modernities in Palestine have multiple beginnings and multiple sources. Although the social and regional roots and markers of modern Palestinian identity are found in the pre-modern period, its distinct modern features evolved gradually, both consciously and unconsciously, from its early beginnings in the 18th century into the 19th and 20th centuries. This evolution was influenced by a range of social and cultural markers, including the social memories and cultural heritage of the medieval Arab Muslim province of Jund Falastin, Gerber 1998a. 2008. Palestine's strong tradition of Arab Islamic jurisprudence and the roots of the modern social, cultural and geographic consciousness of Palestine as a distinct polity and a regional territorially based identity can be traced to the works of Khair ul-Din ul-Ramli, 1585–1671, one of the most extraordinary Palestinian jurists of all times and a prominent 17th century Islamic jurist, public intellectual and writer in Ottoman Palestine, Tucker 2002, Gerber 1998b. Ul-Ramli was a native of Ul-Ramla, and he was named for the town which was for centuries the administrative secular capital of the province of Jund Falastin and a major garrison town in Ottoman Palestine. Ul-Ramli was a landowner and farmer in 17th century Palestine, and his descendants, the Kairis, remained wealthy farmers and prominent figures in the town for nearly 3 centuries until the 1948 Nakba. During the British Mandatory period, Mustafa Khairi served for 4 years as Qadi and a longtime mayor of Ul-Ramla, and his family owned the only cinema in the town. In the 17th century, Khair ul-Din ul-Ramli became well known for issuing a collection of fatwas, religious edicts known as ul-Fatawa ul-Khairiyya, compiled into final form in 1670 that became highly influential in the Sunni Hanafi school of jurisprudence, fiqh, not only in Palestine but throughout the Arab region in the 18th and 19th centuries, Aslahi 2008. And his jurisprudence was highly relevant to family waqf, landownership and agrarian relations in Palestine. Palestine itself had developed a strong tradition of Islamic jurisprudence and one of the founders of the 4 great Sunni schools of Islamic jurisprudence, Imam ul-Shafi'i, 767–820 AD, was born in Gaza, Hadad 2007, 189–190, 193. A brilliant jurist, Al-Shafi'i was known to have been authorized to issue fatwas at very young age. In 17th century Palestine, al-Fatwa al-Khairiyya had major practical dimensions and offers a contemporary record of the period, giving a complex view of agrarian relations in Palestine, as al-Ramli was a jurist, farmer and landowner. He is known to have amassed a big library. He also imported a variety of seeds from Egypt and introduced them to the district of Al-Ramla, Islahi 2008. Al-Ramli's terminology and al-Fatwa al-Khairiyya would also have been known to the administrators of the Sharia courts in Jerusalem in the 18th and 19th centuries. The way al-Din al-Ramli, Muhir al-Din al-Ulaimi and other leading Palestinian Muslim jurists and writers used the term Palestine to refer to their country as Palestine, or to our country, Biladunar, in the 15th to 17th centuries suggests that the territorial notion of Palestine was still very much alive in Palestinian Muslim social and cultural memory throughout the Mamluk and early Ottoman periods. This also contradicts the unfounded claim that the term Palestine had been entirely forgotten by local Arabs, and that it was brought back to them by Arab Christians in touch with Europe. Kramer 2011-16. Several scholars used the works of Muhir al-Din and al-Ramli, for instance, Tucker 2002, Gerber 1998a, 2008, 5051, to trace the pre-modern roots of the emergence of embryonic Palestinian social and territorial consciousness. In Remembering and Imagining Palestine, Identity and Nationalism from the Crusades to the Present Time, Gerber explains, the term Palestine appears later as well. The next writer to use the name lived 2.5 centuries after Muhir al-Din, an independent mufti and legal scholar in Al-Ramla in the 17th century, who left for posterity a most important collection of fatwas, Islamic legal discussions of questions posed by members of the public. A fatwa is a public document, to be read and used, sometimes in courts, by all sorts of people, probably literate, and it is my understanding that the language employed could not have been invented by the Mufti, nor was Kir al-Din al-Ramli an obscure personality. Quite the reverse, all legal jurists from Syria and Palestine after the 17th century used this material intensively and unquestionably knew every fatwa in it inside out. All this information becomes important if we bear in mind that on several occasions Kir al-Din al-Ramli calls the country he was living in Palestine, and unquestionably assumes that his readers do likewise. What is even more remarkable is his use of the term, the country, and even our country, Biladunar, possibly meaning that he had in mind some sort of a loose community focused around that term. Gerber 2008, 50, also Gerber 1998a. The Islamic Farderlinoy al-Quds, Merits of Jerusalem, Literature and the Works of Kir al-Din al-Ramli, of Al-Ramla Palestine, and another Palestinian Muslim compatriot and writer in the 17th century, Saleh ibn Ahmed al-Chumatashi, died in c. 1715, of Gaza, in Palestine, give us another dimension to the multilinear evolution of the concept of Palestine in the course of the late Ottoman period. Al-Chumatashi wrote during the Middle Ottoman period an Islamic Merits of Jerusalem work entitled The Complete Knowledge in Remembering the Holy Land and its Boundaries and Remembering the Land of Palestine and its Boundaries, and Al-Sham, Al-Kabar Al-Tam for Dikr Al-Ard Al-Muqaddasar wa Hududihar wa Dikr Ard Falastin wa Hududihar wa Sham. Al-Chumatashi 1695-1696, Al-Turk 1998, Anapsi 1992, Gerber 2008. 5051. Al-Chumatashi uses the Al-Chumatashi 1695-1696 Anapsi 1992 Gerber 2008. 5051 terms Falastin, the land of Palestine, Ord Falastin, the people of Palestine, Al Falastin, the boundaries or borders of Palestine, Hudud Falastin, and memory of Palestine, Dikr Falastin, to describe his own country. Al-Chumatashi does not create new knowledge on Palestine. In his manuscript, of which 4 copies based on the original manuscript have survived, including 2 at the Center for the Revival of Islamic Heritage in Abidis, Jerusalem, and 1 at the Suleimani Library in Istanbul, Al-Turk 1998. 2.4 He reproduces locally available knowledge and social memories of Arab Islamic Palestine. In the late 17th century, Al-Chumatashi uses a 15th century work by another compatriot, Muhir al-Din, Ulan's Ojaliel by Tariq al-Quds Walkalil, in his reconstruction of the boundaries of Palestine, which, according to him and Muhir al-Din, extended from Al-Aish Rafah in the south to Al-Lajun, in Marj ibn Amer, in the north. All this demonstrates that the social, administrative and geographic memories of Palestine among indigenous Palestinians were very much alive in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 15th-17th centuries among local Palestinians, these centuries of lived and living memories of Islamic Palestine would be far more powerful than the historical memories of Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, among Arabs and Muslims today. These lived memories also show that the term Al-Sham did not displace the indigenous, deeply rooted idea of Palestine throughout the Ottoman period. In fact, the two geographical terms coexisted in indigenous Palestinian social and cultural memories, and, for practical purposes, complemented each other. In Europe, the printing press revolution made sure that the Latin term Palestina and English term Palestine increased their circulation at the time of the European Renaissance. The printing and publication revolution accelerated during the Age of Enlightenment with conscious reference to the classical Greek and Roman heritage in general and the classical heritage of Palestine in particular. It has already been shown that during Europe's great age of exploration from the end of the 15th century to the 18th century, key classical, Greek and Roman works, which described the geography, topography and ethnography of classical and late antiquity Palestina as a country from Phoenicia in the north to Egypt in the south, were circulated widely in Europe. The famous classicizing Christian, Byzantine intellectuals, philosophers and theologians of Palestina Prima, of Gaza, Caesarea Maritima and Ascalon, and the religio-cultural heritage of Palestina were also of interest to Renaissance authors. In fact, in early modern European collective memory, the name Palestine, both in Latin and European vernaculars, became the most common designation of the country. See, for instance, Plet 2004, 512. The fact that the name Palestine remained the most commonly used throughout the early modern and modern eras is evident in William Shakespeare's plays. Syntagma Musicum, Volumes I3, was an encyclopedic work by German musicologist Michael Praetorius, 1571–1621. One of the most versatile composers and musical academics of the 17th century, published in Wittenberg and Wolfenbüttel in 3 parts between 1614 and 1620. It is one of the most commonly used research sources for music theory of the early modern period. Herbert 2006, 87. Typical of its period, the second volume, Der Organographia, describes musical instruments and their use, and refers to early instruments of Palestine, Asia Minor and Greece. Volume 2, Vol 4. 2 points as central to modern European mapping of and writing about Palestine. Provincia Palestina remained synonymous with the Christian notion of Terra Santa, or the Holy Land. Like the Roman and Byzantine conceptualization, but unlike the medieval Islamic idea, the conceptualization of Palestine was always sufficiently wide to include the Galilee and Acre. Indeed, throughout the early and modern periods, especially from the 17th century onwards, dozens of maps and books were printed and published in Europe, in many languages, under the designation Palestine, or a map of Palestine, and in much of this European literature the country of Palestine included Acre and the Galilee. It was this European notion of Palestine which influenced late Ottoman reconceptualization and the Ottoman military handbook named Falastin Risalisi. See below. Al-Dawla al-Qatriyar, Palestinian statehood and the regimes of Dar Umar and Ahmed Pasha al-Jazir in the 18th century. Scholars of the modern Middle East are often preoccupied with the history and politics of urban elites and with nationalism and modernities imported from Europe in the 19th century. This approach tends to focus on urban centers and reproduce elite narratives, while ignoring peasant and frontier societies and the subaltern and marginalized. This approach also contributes to the silencing of much of Palestinian history and divesting the Palestinians of their own sense of identity and collective agency. Palestine and the Palestinian people are rarely allowed to speak for themselves, argued Edward said. They have to be represented by authoritative Western or Israeli scholars, Orientalists, biblical archaeologists, scriptural geographers, said 1980. Or they have to be viewed through the prism of imperial configurations and urban, cosmopolitan, patron-client systems, Mamluk, Ottoman, British. History of urban elites versus history from below. New leadership. Palestine's cotton trade with Europe and the Industrial Revolution. In the 18th and 19th centuries, wheat and cotton shipments from the Palestinian port of Acre to Italy, southern France, Bahiri 1981-67, and England helped save the growing population of France from famine and fueled the English Industrial Revolution and the rise of commodity capitalism in Europe. This brought about the rise of a local bourgeoisie in urban Palestine, in Acre, Nazareth, Tiberias, Nablus, Jerusalem and Jaffa, as well as a peasant economy directed towards export to Europe, as this became the more lucrative market. This move during the 18th century transformed Palestinian agriculture and industry from subsistence towards production for the international market, and brought about a new relationship between larger cities and towns, and the hundreds of villages where most people lived and worked. This increasing international trade with the growing capitalism of Europe, and the insatiable British demand for cotton for its mills, also ushered in early modernities in Palestine. The conventional wisdom about modernity in the Arab world focus on the elite notable, Aegean, politics, the Napoleonic invasion or the Ottoman state's weaknesses as a mix of factors behind the start of modernization in the region. Barham 2007a-16. Furthermore, the conventional wisdom advanced by historians is that early modernities in Palestine were first imported by European missionaries and biblical explorers in the 19th century or disseminated by urban elites educated in European-style schools or schools which operated under Ottoman patronage. The Ottoman Tanzimat, literally reorganizations, a period of major reforms from above that began in 1839 and ended with the Ottoman First Constitutional Era of 1876, and their impact on Palestine and the wider Arab East have been given most scholarly attention. Yet the new evidence contradicts elitist, romantic Orientalist and biblicist approaches to modern Palestinian history. This evidence shows, first, that the start of modernities was in 18th century Palestine, second, that the Napoleonic invasion of Palestine and siege of Acre in 1799 followed rather than led the European material culture and commodities, including European textiles, which became widely available in much of urban and rural Palestine throughout the rules of Umar and Al-Jazar, Barham 2007a, 2007b. Third, that their new economy and new agricultural tools of Palestine in the mid-18th century had already been significantly integrated within the modern international trade and European capitalist economy, which had been ushered in by the British technological and industrial revolutions. Although the European printing and educational revolutions did not catch up with Palestine until the late 19th century, the English Industrial Revolution of the 18th century and rise of European capitalism impacted on the economy of Palestine directly and profoundly. These new forces also contributed to the reorientation of Palestine towards Europe and creation of a new political economy and statehood in mid-18th century Palestine, a statehood that was effectively independent of the weakened Ottoman Empire and which was headed by Palestinian leader Dar al-Umar al-Zaydani, 1689 to 1775. Natives of Safford, the Zaydarnis would have been familiar with the local traditions and social memories of the province of Safford under the Mamluks, Kingdom of Safford. Backed by a professional modern army and most of the Palestinian peasantry, the latter stood up to and defeated the Ottoman army and created a statehood which managed to impose its power and practical sovereignty on much of modern Palestine, despite being resented by many of the Palestinian urban elites of Nablus and Jerusalem. The concept of formal sovereignty has undergone radical transformation in the modern era, from being historically derived from the sovereign, person or ruler, to being linked to the territorial concept of the modern nation-state. However, state, power and legitimacy remain central to their notion of sovereignty. In the 18th century, the practical sovereignty of Umar's regime was not derived from any modern notion of the nation-state, but from the ability of Umar's regime to impose legitimate power on much of Palestine. In view of these dramatic developments in Palestine, a history from below and from within approach can partly explain the rise of Dar al-Umar al-Zaydani and early modernities in Palestine rather than theories of modernities which focus on metropolitan cultural elites in the 18th and 19th centuries or European missionary activities in late Ottoman Palestine. activities which centered on urban Palestine where the majority of the Palestinian Christians resided. Indeed, Umar can easily qualify as the founding father of early Palestinian modernities and social renewal, and the single most influential figure in the beginning of the modern reorientation of Palestine towards the Mediterranean region. In the 18th century, the majority of the Palestinian population, predominantly Muslim, were peasants who lived in villages or small towns, with a few large urban trading centers. The term for modern in 18th century Palestine was jadid, new, or tajdid, renewal, innovation, and it began in these small towns and villages of the Galilee. Powerful local leadership in 18th century Galilee and modernities manifested themselves in a variety of ways. The emergence of a new Palestine-based autonomous rule under both Daher Umar and Ahmed Pasha al-Jazir, 1720 to 1804, a rule independent of both the Ottoman authorities and urban elites. New agricultural and technological innovations in Palestine, which benefited the majority of Palestinian peasantry, began in the 18th century, preceding and anticipating the rise of local urban Palestinian bourgeois nationalism by at least a century, and deeply affected the agricultural production of Palestine. The considerable growth of international and regional export of Palestinian agricultural produce and urban products was shown in the export of Palestinian cotton, olive oil, wheat and soap. Palestinian state monopoly on the flourishing cotton, wheat and olive oil export to Europe, and the international and regional export of Palestinian produce and products generated much-needed new capital for investment in the country. The expansions of small towns and villages and construction of new urban spaces in Palestine in the second half of the 18th century and the beginning of a distinction between their old spaces and the new spaces, Imara al-Jadida, was noted by several authors. Inspired by the model of the neighboring and autonomous Emirate of Mount Lebanon, 1516-1841, Umar's effective leadership, popular backing by much of the Palestinian peasantry, and international trading relations with the French and British all brought about the creation of a Dawla Qatriyar in Palestine, a new state driven by and based on an indigenous agency, whose authority extended from Lebanon to Gaza, and whose modern capital was Acre. This Palestinian Dawla Qatriyar transformed Acre from a small village into a fortified and rich urban metropolitan center. Throughout much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, Acre, effectively and to all practical purposes, functioned as the second capital of modern Palestine. French cotton imports from Palestine and similar British imports following the Industrial Revolution and the rise of new British technologies, with their insatiable demand for cotton, together with the new regional and international trade in cotton, olive oil, silk and textiles, all helped transform Palestinian agriculture and urban spaces in much of the country. New urban spaces and neighborhoods were created in key cities such as Acre and Nablus, making these cities not only into the biggest and wealthiest centers in Palestine, but also among the largest cities of Al-Sham, Dumani 1995, Philip 2001. The newly expanded port of Acre, together with the smaller port of Jaffa, remained the main international gateway to and from Palestine throughout much of the 18th and 19th centuries. After the decline of the Palestine cotton industry, coastal Acre and Nablus, together with Al-Quds at Jerusalem, were still the three most important new urban centers in Palestine and were central to the Ottoman administrative reorganization of the country in the 1870s, as we shall see below. The Mutasarrifate of Noble Jerusalem and the Sanjaks of Acre and Nablus were central to the new, evolutionary paradigm shift in the reconceptualization of late Ottoman Palestine. The British Industrial Revolution also contributed indirectly to the emergence of the first modern Galilee-based state in Palestine in the second half of the 18th century. In Europe throughout the 18th century, the perception of Palestine as a distinct country, separate from Syria, was widespread, and the plethora of European maps of Palestina produced in that century reflected this growing perception of Palestine. In 1747, in the London Modern Gazetteer, page 65, Thomas Salmon, an English geography writer and author of Modern History, or the Present State of All Nations, 1744 to 1746, which provided a short view of the several nations of the world, described Palestine as follows. Palestine, a part of Asiatic Turkey, is situated between 36 and 38 degrees of longitude and between 31 and 34 degrees of latitude, bounded by the Mount Libanus, which divides it from Syria, on the north, by Mount Hermon, which separates it from Arabia Deserta, on the east, by the mountains of Seir, and the deserts of Arabia Petrea, on the south, and by the Mediterranean Sea on the east, so that it seems to have been extremely well secured against foreign invasions. It is generally a fruitful country, producing plenty of corns, wine, and oil where it is cultivated. Point 2. Crucially, political power and practical sovereignty in the Galilee in the 18th century was not the outcome of the imperial patron-client system of the urban leadership, nor did it derive from the central Ottoman authorities. In fact, it evolved from within and from below, and in defiance and actual military resistance to the Ottoman Empire. It was backed by many Palestinian peasants and resented by some of the Ottoman-backed urban elites. With the sharp decline of the Ottoman power, new technological and commercial developments in Europe, and indigenous Palestinian struggle for autonomy emerged from within the Galilee countryside in the mid-18th century. Several factors contributed to this radical development. One of these was due to New Ukraine's exceptional status. Politically, it was an enclave semi-autonomous, if not completely independent of the center of empire and its administration. This began when a local chieftain, Umar, established himself as an independent ruler in the city. His self-declared sovereignty was expanded and interpreted on an even broader scale by his successor, Jaza Pasha. Rosen Island, 1998. 519-520. The astonishing modern rise of the city and province of Acre represented more than anything else the dramatic reorientation of Palestine towards Europe in the 18th century, a reorientation which, unlike previous reorientations of the country by imperial dynasties including the Roman, Umayyad and Ayyubid Mamluk, was engineered by a powerful indigenous Palestinian leader. Indeed, Acre became the capital of Dar al-Umar al-Zaydani for nearly 30 years, from 1746 to 1775, and one of two most powerful trading cities in Palestine. The other one was Nablus. Not surprising, Acre also remained the capital of Umar's successor, Ahmed Pasha al-Jazir, governor of the Ottoman Pashalik in reality, a province of Acre from 1776 until his death in 1804. The dominance of Acre continued well into the early 19th century. After the death of al-Jazir, the Ottoman governors of Acre, Süleyman Pasha al-Adil, died in 1819, and Abdullah Pasha, died in 1831, ruled much of Palestine and Lebanon and Damascus from their Palestinian capital of Acre. The spectacular reorientation of modern Palestine towards the Mediterranean region, Europe, and the dramatic rise of modern Acre in the 18th century began with the emergence and military successes of Umar in Galilee, backed by the Palestinian peasantry. The latter's achievement of autonomous power in Palestine was spurred by revolutionary technological and industrial developments in Europe. The coastal port city of Acre had been a famous Crusade stronghold. In the centuries following the Crusades, the city had slipped into oblivion, and by the time of the Ottoman conquest, Old Acre had become a small fishing village. Philip 2001. Under the Mamluks and throughout the early Ottoman period, the town of Safed replaced Old Acre as the administrative capital of the Galilee. Yet in the middle of the 18th century, modern Acre was the first of the major sites along Palestine's Mediterranean coast that quickly renewed its function as a new, dynamic, major port city following the sharp decline of the coastal cities in the post-Crusader period under both the Ayyubids and Mamluks. Rosen Ireland, 1998. 520. Philip 2001. But by 1785, modern Acre had become one of the largest cities in Palestine and the third largest city in Al-Sham, after Damascus and Aleppo. Philip 2001. Harani's urban elites paradigm. Writing Palestine into the history of the 18th century, the idea of Palestinian social and economic autonomy under the Ottomans was masterfully explored by Bashara Dumani, 1995. with special reference to the social history of 18th century Jabal Nablus. This was done within the framework of Albert Hourani's paradigm of their urban notables, and the political and economic elites in provincial Arab cities and towns that served as patrician intermediaries between the imperial capital in Istanbul and provincial society and governed the provinces of the vast Ottoman Empire. The urban social elites of Palestine, as in the rest of the Arab East, sought to control regional and distant trade and dominate land ownership in the countryside. However, in late Ottoman Palestine, cities were relatively small and urban social elites were dependent on Ottoman patronage and interdependent with their surrounding villages and the mass peasantry of the countryside. But the history of Ottoman Palestine cannot be confined to the politics of Hourani's urban notables or other forms of elite politics, whether this is centered on greedy feudal landlords who exploited the Palestine peasantry through the Ottoman Iltizan land cultivation system or on benevolent aristocratic patricians who set up remarkable charitable waqf foundations in the country. Although these urban elites resisted direct Ottoman rule in Palestine, they were drawn for the most part from the same social classes and their politics remained family-centered, fiercely competitive and deeply fractious. Mao Z 1968, 113, and, ultimately, ineffective. Also, the entire history of Palestine cannot be reduced to one paradigm, the imperial patron-client framework and elite politics. Crucially, this social autonomy of the urban ayans in Palestine cannot account for the dramatic emergence political autonomy from below and from within of an almost independent Palestinian entity in the 18th century, the Dar al-Ummah state of Palestine, which was the closest Palestine got to a modern independent state. However, this elite paradigm of local, urban notables has influenced an entire generation of historians of the modern Middle East. Historians are often wary of challenging established paradigms and, with so many academic careers depending on them, this partly explains why al-Ummah's powerful state in Palestine, which lasted for nearly half a century, has been studied only marginally. Taxation, frontier provinces and the rise of autonomous power in 18th century Palestine. Wolf-Dieter Huttereth and Kamal Abdul Fatah's 1977 seminal work on the historical geography of Palestine, Transjordan and southern Syria in the late 16th century, based on a detailed Ottoman register, Mufassal Defter, describes these regions as frontier zones under Ottoman rule. In 18th century Palestine, the Pashalik of Safed, province of Safed, and Galilee as a whole were a case of a frontier province and a power base for a rising Palestinian local power under nominal Ottoman rule. Appearing first under the Mamluks, the iltizam taxation system was institutionalized by the Ottomans in the 15th century and was carried out by the farming of public tax revenues. The Ottoman state would outsource tax collection by auctioning taxation rights to their highest bidder, multazim, who would then profit, often profligately, from collecting the taxes locally, make payments to the state in fixed installments, while keeping the profit. This outsourcing of the iltizam tax system included the farming of land taxes and urban taxes, the production of certain goods such as wine and salt, and even the provision of certain public services. The outsourcing of the land iltizam tax under the Ottomans, which resembled the Iqtiray system under the Fatimids, gave rise to rich local elites and powerful local chieftains in Palestine and throughout the region. Formally abolished in the course of the reforms, Tanzimat, of 1856, but, in reality, continuing until the end of Ottoman rule in Palestine, Yazbak 1998, 72-73, the iltizam system was very profitable and highly exploitative and was for many centuries of great benefit to powerful local elites under the Mamluks and Ottomans. Abdul Rahman and Nagotter 1977. Certain aspects of the impact of the Ottoman tax farming system, with the growth of local autonomy and rise of powerful chiefs in Palestine, especially within the context of the frontier provinces, can also be seen in the previous rise of the Ghassanid Arab Federate kings, supreme phylaks, of the frontier provinces of Palestina Secundar and Palestina Tertiary in the 6th and early 7th centuries, and in the rise of the Jarrah leaders of the Bedouin tribes of Banu Tay under the Fatimids, until their military defeat by Anushirkin ul-Dizbari, the military governor of Palestine, in 1029 AD. The spectacular rise of Dar al-Ummah in Galilee in the 18th century is also a case in point. His ability to collect taxes efficiently, raise and command an army effectively, forge alliances successfully, and enforce law and order within the context of their frontier province of the Galilee were all part of the mix which explains his rise to power in 18th century Palestine. The closest Palestine got to early modern independent statehood was a result of both commercial dynamism of Palestine and its legendary leader Daher Umar and the continued neglect of the Ottomans. The Zaydani clan, Hamular, of Daher Umar emerged from the Palestinian countryside and periphery of the country, from the Pashalik of Safed, a frontier province under both the Mamluks and Ottomans, not from the traditional major urban centers of the country or the generally pro-Ottoman urban social elites of Palestine. Born in the village of Araba in central Galilee, Umar did not come from the traditional urban landowning aristocracy of Palestine, and, unlike the local notables, he did not owe his legitimacy to the central Ottoman authorities. Umar's family members had served as local multazims, tax collectors, in the provincial towns of Tiberias and Safed in the Pashalik of Safed, and he himself had begun his career as a trader and tax farmer under the Ottoman ultizm system, Kramer 2011, 60. But the Ottoman ultizm land tax system in Palestine had been highly exploitative and oppressive towards the peasantry, and, as we shall see below, Umar's new taxation system and his socially enlightened regime were evidently popular among the Palestinian peasantry. He substantially reduced the power of the urban notables and predatory classes that had fed upon vulnerable social groups, especially the peasants. Umar had received some formal education, but he appears to have been largely self-taught, and his early career, financial competence and practical experience as an efficient tax farmer were of critical value, but it was his political, military, economic, diplomatic and taxation skills which made him perhaps the most powerful leader in modern Palestinian history. His rise to power began in the Galilee countryside, and his first headquarters was Tiberias in eastern Galilee, not the traditional urban centers of the country, Nablus, Jerusalem and Gaza. After rebelling successfully against the Ottoman state and consolidating his regime, Umar became effectively the sovereign ruler of much of Palestine. Following his military victory at Marj ibn Amer in 1735, thousands of local people, including many residents of Nazareth, joined his forces. Apparently among his Galilee supporters were many local Christians, including Christian women from Nazareth who provided his troops with food and water. Judah 1987, 28-31. Over the next 3 decades, Zahir Umar's stature became such that he found it possible to forge temporary alliances with the Russian government and to cooperate with the Mamluks in Egypt. Dumani 1995. 42. Nominal sovereignty versus practical sovereignty. Today there are many formally sovereign states in the Arab world, but not all of them are genuinely sovereign or independent when it comes to foreign policy. By contrast, Umar's state in Palestine was sovereign in substance and reality, while nominally still part of the Ottoman Empire. However, Umar's state was formally recognized by the Ottomans as an autonomous emirate, and at its peak in 1774, a year before he was killed outside Acre, its territory extended from South Lebanon along the entire Palestinian coast to Gaza and included some regions in northern Transjordan. He also twice laid siege to the city of Nablus, Dumani 1995, 42. The headquarters of his administration shifted westwards, from his first capital in Tiberias to Araba in central Galilee, then to Nazareth, then to Deir Hanar, and finally to the port city of Acre in 1746. In the early 16th century, Tiberias had become a city of refuge for Andalusian Arab Jewish survivors of the Spanish Inquisition. These skilled Jewish migrants eventually contributed both to the expansion of the town's silk industry and the growth of Tiberias' role as a trade center between Damascus and the Hijaz. Umar expanded and fortified Tiberias further, but now Acre was the capital of the Galilee and the center of his lucrative international trade with Europe. Acre remained the center of his regime for nearly 3 decades and subsequently became the capital of another autonomous regime in Palestine, that of Ahmed Pasha al-Jazar, their butcher, who lived in the palace built by Umar for another 2 decades from 1776 until 1804. Umar's regime would demonstrate once again the continuing interdependence of urban centers with their rural contexts in Palestine, a continuing feature of the history of Palestine, ancient, Medieval and modern. With his Galilee-based emirate or Dawla Katriyar, Umar became internationally known in the 18th century as the King of Galilee, Nasrallah 2015x. In the mid-18th century, the deeply weakened Ottoman regime had to come to terms with the new power realities in Palestine, a country which remained only nominally part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1768, the Ottoman authorities were forced into a humiliating position of having to recognize Umar's regime in Palestine in the way the Ottomans had been forced to recognize the Emirate of Mount Lebanon and the regime of Emir Farkhaldin a century earlier. The Ottomans granted Umar the title of Sheikh of Acre, Emir of Nazareth, Tiberias, Saved, and Sheikh of all Galilee, Philip 2015. Umar's economic policies, which benefited the Palestinian peasantry, his military strategies and regional and international alliances with the autonomous Druze emirs of Mount Lebanon, Mamluk Egypt and Russia, were partly dictated by his struggle with the Ottoman Empire and partly by his monopolization of the flourishing cotton and olive oil exports to Europe, especially raw cotton to England following its Industrial Revolution and the expanding British textile industry's demand for raw cotton from Palestine and the Near East. Umar's rise to power in the 18th century was facilitated by the considerable growth of cotton cultivation in Palestine and the export of this cash crop to France and England. The use of cotton for fabric is known to date back to prehistoric times, and cotton had been cultivated in ancient Egypt and Persia, and it was also known to the Arabs since antiquity. For many centuries since the Middle Ages, Palestine and the Galilee had been a major area of cotton cultivation. Quater 2002, 27, Lestrange 1890, 1619, 2014, 1819, Markdesai 1994. Already in the 10th century AD, Palestinian historian Quater 2002, 27, Sierra Leonean Leone Strange 1890, 16192014, 1819 Markdesai commented on the fact that cotton was one of the key agricultural products of Palestine, cited in Lestrange 2014, 1819, also Lestrange 2014, 1819-1890, 1619, Markdesai 1994. Sizable cotton cultivation and international trade with Palestine and Sham continued in the course of the Mamluk period but flourished in late Ottoman Palestine, especially in the 18th century. Today, Suq al-Katanin, Market of the Cotton Merchants, also known as Suq of Emir Tankaz al-Naziri, the Mamluk ruler of Palestine and Syria in the Old City of Jerusalem, is a monumental and toponymic testament to the long history and significance of this Palestinian cotton industry. Suq al-Katanin is located on the west side of the Haram al-Sharif. The market dates from 1336 to 1337 AD and contains some of the most exquisite and richest Islamic architecture in Jerusalem. In the middle of the suq there is the signature of one of the craftsmen who worked on its construction, written in Arabic Naskhi script. The inscription reads, "May God have mercy on him, the work of Muhammad bin Ahmed bin Ailish." The suq has two entrances, one to the west and the other to the east, called Bab al-Katanin, Gate of the Cotton Merchants, which opens onto the west side of the Haram. Suq al-Katanin is considered to be one of the most complete and beautiful medieval suqs not only in Palestine, but in the whole of the Near East. Begoin 1987, Begoin and Arbu al-Hajj 1979, 128 to 129. Point 3. From the time of the Crusades, the Levant and North Palestine had supplied both regional and European textile markets via port cities such as Acre. The cultivation of cotton in Palestine was maintained throughout the Ottoman period but grew dramatically in the 18th century under the effective leadership of Umar, who got involved in the world's most profitable commodity at the time, cotton. Umar's rise coincided with the rise of French and British demand for raw cotton following the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. British capitalism and their manufacturing industries of Lancashire enabled Britain to emerge as their leading exporter of manufactured textiles. From the late 18th century onwards, the British city of Manchester acquired the nickname Cottonpolis due to the cotton industry's predominance within the city, and Manchester's role at the heart of the regional and international cotton trade. Of course, the incorporation of Palestine into the modern European markets and British-dominated global capitalist system and import of textiles from Lancashire to Palestine posed a major challenge to the locally produced textiles in Palestine. Dumarni 1995. Umar's rule was of modern creation. His administration grew rich on foreign export of cotton and olive oil, and his rule consolidated and expanded this lucrative trade with Europe, and by the mid-18th century regional and global trade in cotton and textiles made his capital city of Acre and the Palestinian city of Nablus the biggest and the most prosperous cities in the country and among the largest cities of Ulsham. Dumarni 1995. Philip 2001. Despite the massive technological developments in Europe in the 19th century and subsequent decline of the cotton economy of the Galilee, Heed 1942. Even in the mid-19th century, the British consul in Jerusalem James Finn would recall his journeys in central Palestine and the Nablus-Jenin-Tulkarem triangle, and note that the cotton plantations he visited were beautifully clean and orderly. Camel 2015. In fact, as a consequence of Umar's policies, for over a century between the 1730s and 1860s, cotton would remain the main export from Palestine to Europe. Before 1852, Palestine exported its cotton mainly to the Ulsham region, Italy, France, and, to a lesser extent, England. In 1859, it was reported by a British geographical gazetteer that tobacco, lent, eels, olives, cotton and silk are extensively produced in this pash, like of Acre, a part of Palestine. The only manufactures are silk and cotton fabrics. The situation of this district is highly favorable to commerce. The exports from Acre and Beirut, its principal ports, are wool, cotton, silk, tobacco, gums, dried fruits, gallnuts, madder root, and skins. The export trade is principally carried on with France and Italy. This pash, is of modern creation. In 1749 it formed part of the pash, of Sidon or Sidon, when Dahir, son of Omar, an Arab sheikh, having invaded Acre, succeeded in subduing the whole pash, to his way. However, after 1870 cotton lost its leading role as the key cash crop shipped to Europe, being replaced by the oranges of Palestine, the iconic Jaffa oranges. Benefiting from new agricultural innovations and new tree grafting techniques, the Palestine Arab citrus industry became the #1 produce exported to Europe throughout the last quarter of the 19th century. Lucas 2003, 21-22. During the second half of the 19th century, modern cotton spinning machinery was also imported into Palestine, and a small-scale cotton spinning industry continued into the 20th century. Interestingly, in the 18th century, the high quality of Palestinian and Levantine cotton seeds led to its transferal to the soils of the colonies of North America. But unlike the settler colonialism of North America, in which cultivating and harvesting cotton became the leading occupation of slaves, the Palestine cotton plantations were cultivated by ordinary farmers. Yet still, cotton production in the Levant during the late 18th century exceeded, by a factor of nearly 30, that in the American colonies. Quater 2002, 27. The expanded port city of Acre became the first modern Palestinian city in the 18th century to be directly affected by the new foreign trade, the British Industrial Revolution, and England's demand for raw cotton. For a century between 1730 and 1831, the export of highly profitable cash crops, first cotton and then grain, made Acre the largest center of trade and political power on the Palestinian-Lebanese coast. The city also began to play a role in international politics in the last quarter of the 18th century. Philip 2001, 3. First under Umar and later under Al-Jazir, the Acre-based ruler from 1776 until his death in 1804. Modern Acre was the key to the first region in the eastern Mediterranean that was tied into modern economy, an important fortified city of perhaps 25,000 inhabitants, which was closely connected with the ever-rising demand for cotton in Europe. Philip 2001, 1. Under the impact of international trade during the rule of both Umar and Al-Jazir. Within a very short period of time, Modern Acre bloomed into a city possessing several mosques, caravansaries, public baths and markets. It also boasted fortified walls and an aqueduct to ensure its water supply. The Galilee villages further inland developed most of what was to become the basis of Palestine's agricultural economy. Rosen Island, 1998. 520. Of modern creation, and perhaps the most monumental symbol of the culture of early modern Palestine, is the White Mosque of Modern Acre, famously known as Al-Jazr Mosque, which became the most powerful symbol of the modern capital of northern Palestine. Constructed in 1781, 18 years before the Napoleonic invasion of Palestine, and influenced architecturally by the Grand Ottoman Mosques of Istanbul, its namesake, the White Mosque, evoked memories of the famous White Mosque of Al-Ramla, the capital of Junt Palestine, the province of Palestine throughout early Islam. The compound of the White Mosque included an Islamic theological academy, the first college of its kind in Palestine. Modeled on the Al-Azhar University College of Cairo, and departing from the traditional medieval Islamic schools, madrasas, of Jerusalem, the mosque college compound contained student lodging, an Islamic court and a major public library, all paid for by Palestinian local taxes and by the flourishing regional and international trade in cotton and other cash crops of Palestine. Spectacularly overlooking the eastern Mediterranean Sea, Al-Jazr Mosque was also a statement of the reorientation of modern Palestine towards Europe under the impact of the international trade policies and the monumental building programs pursued by the two powerful leaders, Al-Umar and Al-Jazr. The encouragement of foreign trade, promotion of local agricultural innovations and export of profitable cash crops such as cotton, grain and olive oil to Europe, which began under Al-Umar in the 1730s, continued until 1830, and the legacy of this foreign trade stimulated the development in the Shamuti orange, which became internationally known as the Jaffa orange. Developed by Palestinian farmers in the mid-19th century, Shamuti oranges were an almost seedless variety of oranges with a tough skin that made them particularly suitable for international export. Isori 2006, 127. Gerber 1982. Like the export of Palestine cotton and grain in the 18th and 19th centuries, much of the Shamuti orange crop was exported to France and England from the mid-19th century onwards. Al-Umar's powerful state ushered in a new dynamic era in Palestine. After a long period of Ottoman neglect, stagnation and rampant exploitation of the Palestinian peasantry, during which Palestine was turned into a frontier country and an imperial backwater. In this new dynastic period under Al-Umar, the Galilee and large parts of Palestine experienced effective and fair taxation, urban expansion and economic development. Many public buildings, fortresses, fortifications, warehouses, khans, caravansaries, the most spectacular of which is the exquisitely built Khan al-Tojar of Acre. Today the site is at the center of Israeli Judaization policies in the Arab city, and numerous places of worship were built throughout his domain. Many of these sites and monuments can still be seen today throughout the Galilee. Al-Umar's state pursued religiously inclusive policies and encouraged the involvement of religious minorities, Christians, Jews and Shiites, in his administration, finance and economy. Statehood and early modernities in 18th century Palestine were intertwined. Under the leadership of Dahir al-Umar al-Zaydani, 1730-75, a powerful and protective state was formed in northern Palestine that fostered development. Security was ensured for agricultural production, mainly wheat and cotton for export, particularly to France, whose agents resided in the Zaydani capital and port of Acre. Peasants and religious minorities were protected and thus had a stake in the success of the state. In 1764-65, Al-Umar established a new town, Haifa, and secured it with walls. Sikali 2002b 97. Their political stability and effective and fair taxation system provided by Al-Umar in northern Palestine, and the expansion and transformation of historic urban centers such Acre, Tiberias and Safed also led to the founding of modern Haifa and the transformation of Nazareth from a small village into a major town in Palestine. Modern Haifa, or their new Haifa, Haifa al-Jadida, was founded by Al-Umar Umar in 1764-1765. This was done by moving the 250 local inhabitants to the fortified village of Haifa 2.4 kilometers to the east of the old hamlet. 5. This new modern Palestinian Arab village became the nucleus of the modern town of Haifa, Yazbak 1998. Today the third largest city in Israel. The new village was originally named in Arabic Amara ul-Jadida, the new construction, a term applied to modern buildings in Palestine in the 18th century. Local Palestinians first called the village New Haifa and later simply Haifa. This new Arab village grew into an Arab town which in the 20th century developed into the modern city of Haifa, Sikali 2002a. 2002b, Sharon Sikali 2002a 2002b 2013, 262, Mariti 1792, 318. In a similar vein, their new era of Ummah state symbolized the beginning of the modern history of Palestine. The new agricultural economy and foreign trade of Palestine led to the transformation of Nazareth al-Nasira in Arabic, retaining their feminine endings common to many Palestinian Arabic toponyms of Galilee by Ummah state from a small hamlet into a large town by encouraging immigration to it. Their new town of Nazareth played important economic, religious and strategic roles under Ummah's rule. Ummah's fourth capital was Nazareth, and for this purpose he commissioned the construction of a new government house known as the Sarayar, their palace. This historic building was constructed around 1740 and later in the 19th century served as the residence of the local Ottoman governor of Nazareth and its sub-district, and subsequently as the city's municipal headquarters until 1991. While using Nazareth to secure his control over the hugely fertile agricultural lands of central Galilee, Yazbak 1998, 15, and Marj ibn Amer, the rich granary of Palestine, Umar encouraged religious toleration and protected the Christian communities in the town, which he also used to strengthen his international ties with France. Amid 1995, 22. Umar also encouraged the Franciscans to purchase land and build a church in Nazareth in 1730, and enabled the Greek Orthodox community to build St. Gabriel Church in 1767, amid 1995. 220, beginning as a market town for the surrounding countryside under Dar al-Umar. Today Nazareth is the largest Palestinian city in Israel and the capital of the Palestinians inside Israel. Today the descendants of Umar still live in Galilee and Nazareth and are known as their Dawari, in memory of Dahar, along with the Fahums, Zubayyis, and Onalers, the Muslim families which constituted part of Nazareth's urban traditional Muslim landowning elite, which first rose under Umar's rule and continued to dominate the city's politics throughout the late Ottoman and British mandatory periods and under Israel since 1948. Sruji 2003. 187. Modern geopolitical representations of Palestine are often located in the late Ottoman period or in 19th century Palestine, and the actual historical links between the Palestinian statehood created by Umar and the modern conceptions of Palestine are complex. However, in history the line between fact and fiction or myth and reality is often blurred. The practically independent statehood in Palestine lasted nearly half a century from the late 1720s until 1775, far longer than the British mandatory period in Palestine. Reading the history of modern Palestine through the eyes of the indigenous people. Reading the history of modern Palestine through the eyes of the indigenous people can shift the emphasis away from hegemonic Ottoman, British and Zionist gaze and chronologies and provide new indigenous perspectives. Modern New Acre can be a case study of this perspective. This beautiful and iconic capital of Ummah's state rose from the ashes to become one of the most important modern Palestinian urban centers for nearly 2 centuries. This was less to do with Imperial Ottoman calculations or their Ottoman heritage, and more the result of sheer indigenous determination and self-definition. However, by the end of the 19th century, Acre's standing had declined to the advantage of the nearby coastal town of Haifa, as new powerful steam engines were developed in the west, powering bigger ships. New trade routes were opened up and the coast of Palestine became part of the regular route of the major European steamship companies. Seekly 2002b, 97. With the rise of anti-colonialist Palestinian nationalism, the emergence of new approaches to people's history, and the decline of elite narratives, Ul-Umma has emerged as a nationalist hero among Palestinians today. Judah 1987, 2015. Yet Ul-Umma's self-governing entity should be seen within the context of his age. Clearly his aims were dynastic, not nationalist. Anxious to approve a historical basis for Palestinian independence, Palestinians often refer to the effort of the Palestinian leader Dar al-Umar to wrest control of much of Palestine from the Ottomans in the late 18th century. But to attribute these challenges to a national, territorially based consciousness is an altogether different and murky issue. Arbu Lughod 1988, 203. Nevertheless, Umar's emergence from a relatively humble background from within Palestine, his effective leadership, his popularity among the Palestinian peasantry for getting rid of the oppressive Ottoman ultiism system, at least under his rule, his spectacular military successes, his effective resistance to Ottoman imperial direct rule in Palestine, and his religiously tolerant policies towards Christians, Jews, Druze and Shiites all combined to give him a mythical status among Palestinians. Real and imagined, Umar provided a role model for modern Palestinians. However, Palestinian national consciousness, as opposed to 18th century early modernities in Palestine, is a late Ottoman development, and there is no historical evidence that a nationalist Palestinian ideology existed at the time of or was developed by Umar. Evidently a nationalist myth of Dahir Umar as the founder of the first modern Palestinian national state is far more powerful and inspiring than the actual context of this powerful leader and his age. Yet the historical legacy of his self-fashioned and self-governing Palestinian entity and the lasting impact of its policies on modern Palestine are undeniable. Also, crucially, for much of the 18th century the Galilee-based autonomous regimes of Umar and Al-Jazir, with their close trade links and military alliances with European powers, Russia, Britain and France in particular, politically and physically linked the Galilee with the entire Palestinian coast from Lebanon to Gaza under a Palestine-based single administration. From the perspective of viewing Palestine as a single geo-political entity, the impact of this historic legacy of the 18th century would soon become evident in the way new representations of Palestine evolved in the 19th century. European influences on their modernizing and enlightened administration of Dar al-Umar were much in evidence. These early modernization efforts were facilitated by the fact the conservative religious authority in the country, which rested with the muftis in the cities of Palestine, was always subordinate to the political authority. Italian antiquarian, scientist and traveler Giovanni Filippo Mariti, who arrived in Acre in 1760 and resided in the French Quarter for 2 years, writes in Travels Through Cyprus, Syria, and Palestine about the influence of European ideas on the capital of Dar al-Umar, Acre. He describes the swift response of the governor of Acre to the then raging plague, which was affecting not only Palestine, but also Egypt and Syria. Large and small epidemics, occasionally combined with famine, had been a recurrent feature of medieval Palestine, with devastating effects in terms of the high death toll in the country. Small epidemics also occurred in the Mediterranean port cities of Palestine during the First and Second World War. Yet in 1760 the enlightened Umar acted decisively, brushing aside religious superstitions and imposing precautionary measures including a strict quarantine in Acre and measures affecting traders entering and leaving the city. These measures helped to minimize the effect of the epidemic on the crowded city and saved many lives. The governor of Acre checked the progress of this plague by giving the inhabitants the means of withdrawing from its ravages, and these means, though contrary to the dogmas of the Mohammedan religion, were eagerly embraced. The Europeans became their models, and the governor, after deriving them from every necessary information, shut himself up, after their example, together with his numerous family. The Mufti, top religious judge of Acre alone, born the protector of the Mohammedan law, cannot imitate a conduct which that law condemns. Instead of shutting himself up with silence in a prudent confinement, he thundered forth against this new method, reproached the governor for his conduct. The governor, however, only laughed at this pious folly of the Mufti and sent a detachment of soldiers to impose a fine on him of 250 sequins. 6 Mariti 1792, 200-201, 203-204. Umar, like Muhammad Ali of Egypt, 1769 to 1849, and unlike the Palestinian Ottoman urban elites of Nablus and Jerusalem, was a rule breaker and a ruler maker, not a rule taker. These urban elites were in a subordinate state of affairs where the power dynamic put them at a position of less influence, authority, and significance than their imperial Ottoman rule maker. By contrast, Umar's effectively independent regime was created in direct opposition and as a challenge to the authority of the Ottoman rule in Palestine, while nominally acknowledging the legitimacy of the Ottoman Caliph. Umar's authority operated within the context of Islamic legitimacy and power, and Islamic history of Palestine produced a variety of notions of power, authority, and legitimacy. Umar's state has been referred to by its detractors as a sheikhdom, while the late Albert Arani referred to it as a little kingdom, cited in Jowder 2015. But it would be more appropriate to describe it as a sovereign frontier state in most of Palestine for over a quarter of a century. However, it could be described as an emirate within the wider historical Islamic context of power and legitimacy. Historically, an emirate was a geopolitical entity or state that was ruled by a Muslim emir, sultan, sheikh, military commander, governor, or prince. Etymologically, emirate or emirate, Arabic, amara, is the administration of territorial entity of an emir. The Arabic term could also imply principality. Under Islam, and until recently, emirates were a common form of governance and actual statehood. The variety of emirates included the famous Emirate of Cordoba, which was an independent state in Andalusia between 756 and 929. With Cordoba as its capital. Initially acknowledging the legitimacy of the Umayyad caliphs in Damascus, in fact the Emirate of Cordoba not only grew in direct opposition to the Abbasid state and rejection of the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, but also evolved and transformed itself into the Caliphate of Cordoba. With its capital in Cordoba, this state existed from 929 to 1031 and was at the time one of the most developed countries in the world. Also in Andalusia, the Emirate of Granada, also known as the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada, Spanish, Reino Nazarí de Granada, was established in 1248 and aligned with the Christian Kingdom of Castile, and remained a tributary state for the next 250 years. It was the last state in the Iberian Peninsula to be ruled by Muslims. Several centuries later, at the height of Umar's power in Palestine in the mid-18th century, Kuwait became an emirate in the 1750s, headed by the Sheikh of Kuwait. In the late 19th century, the Emirate of Kuwait became a British protectorate, and it has since evolved into a modern state. Had Umar's state survived the death of its founder in 1775 and persisted well into the 19th century, today the modern history of Palestine would be read and written with the eyes of the indigenous people of Palestine, rather than through Ottoman, British or Zionist perspectives. The lasting impact of Umar's Dawla Qatriyar and Uljaz's powerful autonomous regime on both European and late Ottoman thinking, as well as on the modern Palestinian psyche and memories, can hardly be overstated. In the mid-18th century, Umar shifted the center of power in Galilee from Safed and the Loire of Safed to Acre, a town which Umar transformed into one of the biggest, wealthiest and most well-fortified cities of the Sham region. It is hardly a coincidence, therefore, that in 1799 Napoleon Bonaparte sought but failed to conquer the city. 70 years later, in the early 1870s, as we shall see in Chapter 9, the Ottomans reorganized Palestine and created the Sanjak of Acre as one of 3 administrative regions in the country. For nearly 5 centuries, from 1266 until the early 18th century, Safed was the capital of the Galilee, and after 1517 the Ottomans confirmed its administrative position in Galilee by creating the administrative Sanjak of Safed. In view of the fact that the Safed had dominated the Galilee and northern Palestine for centuries under both the Mamluks and Ottomans, the creation of the Sanjak of Acre in the late Ottoman period should also be counted as one of the lasting legacies of 18th century Palestine under Umar and Al-Jazir for the late Ottoman perception and administrative reorganization of Palestine. Above all, Umar's powerful regime provided an alternative model to the intermediary, patron-client, elite politics of Palestine and to the family-oriented, fiercely competitive and deeply fractious urban elite politics which bedeviled both late Ottoman and mandatory Palestine until 1948.